First of all, thank you to Jody as always. So we had, I think, where the requests came from last week, those people aren't here as much, but there was a bit, last week we talked about Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who was sort of the, one of the most important, if not the most influential modern Orthodox Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. And there was some pushback on it being a very sort of, and being more particularist in terms of an Orthodox perspective on the Jewish tradition. And so today we're going to talk about someone who probably, if anything, aligns more with the conservative movement, if you want to sort of pigeonhole him. But a bit of background. So first of all, just because not everyone's been here before, broad background is that this set of classes is just a set of discussions on different important modern Jewish philosophers, mostly of the 20th century. We've talked about Maimonides, who's an ancient Jewish philosopher, but was important for providing context because all Jewish philosophers sort of live in his shadow, so to speak, or in conversation with him. We talked about a few different people. We talked about Eliezer Berkovitz, who in a few sentences saw the vision or goal of the Jewish tradition as trying to create or embody a model society, and that involved building a model political society, communities, etc. And so it was a sort of grand project. Then we talked as well about Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, where he was more particularly focused on the Jewish tradition as enabling individuals to achieve a certain type of spiritual freedom that we talked about. If anyone wants to go into detail, the videos are available. This week we're going to talk about a philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig, who was born in the late 19th century, in the 1880s. He died in 1929. Lived his entire life in Germany, and there's one important thing that's very different from him, that's different about him from everyone we've talked about so far, is all the other sort of Jewish thinkers we've talked about were born into the Jewish tradition and very engaged. Were born into the world of Jewish learning, of Jewish yeshivas, studied philosophy separately or sort of in addition, and that impacted or influenced how they understood the Jewish tradition. Franz Rosenzweig took the opposite path. He was born to an entirely secular Jewish family in 19th century Germany, was brought up with no real, maybe sort of a cultural Jewish affiliation, but that's it, and was educated in the secular philosophical tradition, was sort of becoming an influential philosopher in the German philosophical world, unrelated to Judaism. And we'll talk a bit more about his biography, but then sort of came upon Judaism sort of almost left the Jewish tradition, was about to convert, and we'll talk about that story, but sort of re-engaged as a Jew, and then started to learn more and more about Judaism. But after he had sort of already built a bit of more of a sort of philosophical perspective outside the Jewish tradition. And so the language that we'll use and what we'll talk about in his in sort of studying his thought starts a lot more with sort of what doesn't necessarily look like uniquely Jewish language, and then he sort of fits that into Judaism, very much in contrast to everyone else we've talked about who comes from sort of deeply Jewish roots. So a bit more in detail about that biography. So like I said, born in the 1880s in a secular German family, goes to study initially medicine, becomes sort of a student of philosophy, and becomes engaged in the German philosophical world. Studied primarily under people who were influenced by a German thinker named George Hegel. So Hegel we talked a bit about Kant when we talked about about Berkovitz and Soloveitchik. Hegel is sort of a German philosopher after Kant, is one of the most important modern philosophers in the secular world. And one of the things that's sort of very important for our context in Hegel is Hegel saw world history as moving towards some sort of culmination, that there was sort of a world spirit or sort of a grand, not necessarily from a theological or religious perspective, but there was sort of a pre-designed construct or sort of path in which history was going. Every individual just sort of had to fold into that path. Your individual life wasn't that important in terms of that path. And that
an arc of history.
There's an arc of history. If you've ever heard like the saying of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, I've ever heard that there's like a sort of things start with one thing. There's sort of a certain position taken. You can see this in all sorts. He read history this way. But let's say there's like a far left wing position taken. Then there's a response. That's a thesis. Then there's a response, the antithesis, that sort of comes to combat it. And then those merge into some sort of synthesis, and that synthesis is like a new position. Then again, there's a new antithesis to that synthesis, and it's an arc of history that just keeps evolving. Anyways, Hegel saw, we're not going to get into Hegel here, but Hegel saw history as taking this sort of on this predetermined march, and it ended in a sort of Protestantism that was I don't know if you want to call it religious or not, but it ended in a sort of messianic Protestantism, call it that. The reason that's important for us is Rosenzweig, sort of in studying Hegel at the beginning, sort of in his studies of philosophy, sort of started to buy into this world. And he actually was going to convert to sort of Protestantism. He saw that as the culmination of world history, sort of a messianic something. And he ends up and this is now, we're now into, he was born in the 1880s, we're now just before World War I, this is around 1912, 1913. But in order to convert to Protestantism as a good Hegelian, as someone in that school, he has to do it as a Jew. The reason, again, is there's this arc of history where each thing sort of is a ladder to the next. And so Judaism sort of led to and gave birth to Christianity, eventually Protestantism. And so he has to convert to Protestant. He has to convert as a Jew to follow sort of this arc of history. He ends up, and this is like a bit become almost like a folk tale, but he ends up going to this sort of Yom Kippur ceremony. Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year. He goes to this Yom Kippur sort of shtibel, like this sort of small traditional synagogue. And he comes out a Jew. He comes out sort of like re-embracing his Judaism. No one really knows why or what happened.
Authentically.
He stops the conversion in its path. He then gets shipped off to the Balkan front as a German soldier in World War I, from which he starts to, and now I don't remember if he both finishes his thesis on Hegel, but also starts to write his major work of Jewish philosophy in letters home, maybe like a good Jew, like in letters home to his mom from the Balkan front of the war. And then when he comes back at the end of the war, he finishes this sort of great work of Jewish philosophy. It's called The Star of Redemption. And he becomes engaged in building this sort of Jewish house of adult learning in Frankfurt that becomes a very important place where all these influential sort of liberal Jewish thinkers teach. He gets ALS in the early 1920s to the point where he can really becomes paralyzed, can really only communicate with his eyes. But at that point, we can still not speak, not communicate, he's paralyzed. He continues to write through basically using eye movements to indicate letters to his wife and to some colleagues. He continues to write essays. He finishes a translation of the Bible into German with Martin Buber, who maybe we'll cover as another important German thinker. Basically, prolifically continues to actually engage in this sort of intellectual, his re-engagement with Judaism through ALS and to be influential in that. Dies in 1929 before Hitler comes to power. Some of the things we'll see, who knows how they would have changed had he sort of lived to see Hitler. But that's sort of the biography. Okay.
What did he have that he died so young?
ALS.
Lou Gehrig's.
Yeah, Lou Gehrig's disease.
Is it on record?
Before
It
Lou
is on
Gehrig.
record.
Okay.
To make sure.
Okay.
I'm going to double check. Oh.
If his name were
I just put it on dark. Yes, we are recording.
if his name were easier to pronounce, he may have the name of the disease.
It's possible. It's true. It was before. Yeah, it wasn't Lou Gehrig disease yet. All right. So if everyone has, I don't know if everyone has these sheets, but we'll read. So the sources I brought. If anyone has ever or does ever try to read a German philosopher, it's brutal. There's some there. Like any field, there's people who are more and less readable and more or less accessible. German philosophers write in the most illegible ways possible. So a lot of the sources we've brought are a combination of secondary sources like articles about Rosenzweig. I'll be honest, I use ChatGPT also to summarize certain things in ways that were more clear. So there are some direct quotes, but there's a lot of sort of secondary sources and summaries because it's a lot more legible that way. Okay, so the first set of sources we called section 1 is the new thinking. The new thinking is, so we talked about a bit about that.
I looked here, no one was here.
We talked a bit about that German philosophical world that Rosenzweig was a part of. So the new thinking, Rosenzweig sort of wanted to push himself away. He thought that world was he thought it got rid of the individual, got rid of experienced life for some sort of more like grand philosophical conception that ignored the way people actually lived and experienced the world. So before we get into his actual thought, we want to show a bit of what he thought, how he thought he was thinking, what he thought this sort of new way of approaching philosophy was. Okay, so this first source is actually from an essay by Franz Rosenzweig himself, and then we'll read a bit of a summary of it. So he writes, the idea of making truth true is the basic idea of the new theory of knowledge. And the static concept of objectivity is replaced by one that is dynamic. From those unimportant truths of the type twice 2 equals 4, to which men lightly assent with the expenditure of no more than a trifle of mind energy, the way leads to those truths which man is willing to pay something, onto those which he cannot prove true, except with the sacrifice of his life. Okay, basically what he's saying is, I want to go after a new type of truth. If philosophy was always trying to get to some sort of objective truth, They were trying to get to truths like, for example, 2 + 2 = 4 in a simple way, or the theory of truth is about science and the world and relativity. Saying all these truths that philosophy was trying to get to don't actually speak to individual lived life. They're sort of external. They're external truths about the world, but they're not the truth of the experience of life. They're not truths that men die for. They're truths that sort of live out there. He's going after something different. And now if you go to source B, this is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a good online resource. It's a sort of that has articles on basically every thinker or concept in modern, at least in a lot of different philosophers, not inherently Jewish. And here, this is their entry on Franz Rosenzweig, their explanation of this new thinking, this way of doing philosophy that Rosenzweig was trying to get at. So Rosenzweig understood himself to be living at a transitional moment in the history of philosophy, the system of German idealism. That's a school of thought that Hegel, that we talked about, was very important in. By Rosenzweig's account, brought to completion a 2,500-year arc of philosophical thinking. In so doing, they brought to light tendencies of the philosophical tradition that prevented its representatives from achieving the very knowledge they set out to attain. Okay, so basically, he thinks philosophy's come to a conclusion where it's hit a 2,500-year dead end, from basically pre-Plato, from early Greek philosophy, down till the thinkers that he was studying. He said we've hit a dead end because they've been trying to get at truth, and they've been doing a few things wrong the whole time. What have they been doing wrong? So one, abstracting from time. In their quest to grasp what is universally and essentially true, philosophers abstract from the temporal, relational context in which human beings experience the world around them. So, very simple example. There's a concept, if everyone ever heard of the phrase a Platonic form. So Plato, who's an early Greek philosopher, has this sort of concept of the world that for every category we have, so take a simple category, dogs, right? You start showing a kid pictures of dogs, pictures of all sorts of different dogs. You can say this one's a dog, that one's a dog, that one's a dog. That picture's not a dog. How do you get that? How do you know? They can start to blend into each other. What looks like a cat? What's a dog? What's a whatever? Plato has this idea of there's this perfect, they call it a form, this perfect ideal of a dog, and any example of that in the world fits into that kind of perfect image. It's the perfect definition. Why? So Rosenzweig saying here, philosophers tried to get at a truth that was outside of time. That's atemporal, that's sort of this pure eternal truth thing. That's not the way we live life. Things are constantly evolving and changing. If you want to, and maybe this analogy is a little bad, but species are evolving, right? At a certain point, you crossmate species, a dog might evolve into something, is a wolf a dog, is a hyena. Trying to get these atemporal perfect truths doesn't work in lived life in reality. I won't read through the other points here. You can read them separately on your own. But basically what Rosenzweig wants to get at is philosophy was trying to get to this. Philosophers were trying to get to some sort of perfect truth outside of time. Religious philosophers too. If you we talked a little bit about Maimonides, right? For Maimonides, the goal of Judaism, the goal of the Jewish tradition, was to achieve perfect understanding of the divine, of God as we talked about, as almost like the battery that keeps the world going. And it's getting to some sort of true metaphysical knowledge of what the world is about and what exists outside of space and time, beyond humans. Rosenzweig saying that doesn't speak to the truth in terms of the way humans experience the world. There's something messed up about that whole way of doing philosophy. We have to start in a different place. In doing this, Rosenzweig is actually participating in a philosophical movement of the 19th century that's beyond just him, that's called existentialism. So, and yet existentialism comes to use if people say I'm having an existential crisis, right? They're having a crisis about what their life's about, what things mean, what's important. What existentialism does, and what Rosenzweig does is participating in that, is saying stop trying to understand the world top down. Stop trying to get to some perfect form of logic of what's true. The world starts with human experience. It starts with your individual experience of the world and what's going on, and build up from there. That's how we get to something true about the world in our lives. Okay, so where does Rosenzweig go? So as much as he's trying to say I'm not a philosopher about life, he's still very much a philosopher and writes like a philosopher. So, and we're going to get to Judaism eventually. Like I said, the other thinkers we covered started as Jewish thinkers and then brought in philosophy. He starts as a philosopher and then brings it to sort of how he understands the role of Judaism. So in this sort of magnum opus, this sort of, his most important work he writes about the Jewish tradition called Star of Redemption, he starts by saying, in my experience of the world, as opposed to some sort of top-down thing, there's three basic types of beings that exist and that experience the world that we have to sort of deal with. One is humans, man. One is other creatures, living things, and other things in the world, and one is God. These for him are like fundamental. These are like the three different types of fundamental things that walk around, that exist, that are out there in the world. So if you look at section 2 of the sources on the second page, so let's just, we'll define each of them, and then we'll define how they relate to each other, and that will start to bring us to Judaism. So what's man, or humans? Rosenzweig sees man not as an isolated, self-sufficient being, as in rationalist philosophies. Like rational philosophers say, man can think, or like economists, right? Man can like think about the world, where these pure rational beings just like make steps of deductive logic, saying man isn't some sort of self-sufficient rational being. He's not some sort of domino in some Hegelian system of history that's sort of just a pawn in the system of history. He's a being who exists, who stands in relationship to God, to other human beings in the world. What it means to be human is to be in the world relating to each of these three things. You're interacting with other humans, with the world, and we'll define what God is, right? But you're interacting with God.
Economists are starting to catch up with that.
Yeah, we're not so rational. Yeah, no, we're not all accepting we're so rational anymore. We're a lot more relational in the way we interact, for sure. So, and like you said, people like Daniel Kahneman, right? Like no longer, we're not so rational. But man's defining characteristic is his capacity to respond to revelation and participate in redemption. So we'll define these terms. But revelation traditionally in religious thought is God revealing himself to man. For Rosenzweig, we'll get to it, revelation is the way man is confronted by the divine, by the whatever God is, but man's being confronted in the world and challenged in the world by a God or by something beyond him. That's revelation. And participating in redemption is man's sort of attempt to bring the world to and others to a more complete place. But anyways, man is this creature who finds himself existing in time and interacting with other humans, with the world, and with some sort of God that challenges him. That's man. The world, in the Star of Redemption, Franz Rosenzweig presents the world as distinct from both God and man, but dynamically related to both. Unlike traditional metaphysical systems, which often reduce the world to either an extension of divine being or a backdrop for human action, Rosenzweig sees the world as independent created reality that exists in an unfinished state awaiting redemption. Okay, so if you get to like medieval types of religious philosophy, what they'll talk about, and this is again part of this sort of like this rational philosophy that doesn't deal with lived life from Rosenzweig's perspective, but old school medieval religious philosophy will see sort of everything starting in God, and everything else is kind of an emanation from or an expression of God. By the way, this is in a lot of Jewish mystical thought. This is the case. There's the absolute sort of, there's some sort of infinite substance, something beyond there, and everything in the world we experience or see is sort of a manifestation of God. That gets parlayed in sort of common religious thought of like, God is in everything, God is everywhere. Everything is God, right? And that's the sort of mystical approach. Rosenzweig says, no, not everything's God. Like, we're people, like, we're humans. That's our starting point. He says there is a God, there is something that confronts us, but that's not us. That's a different thing. Don't try to conflate everything. Okay, so there's a world. There's man we talked about. There's the world which lives separate from man, separate from God. It's all the stuff we interact with other than other people. And then there's God. For Rosenzweig, God is not a static being, but a relational presence, the wholly other who creates, reveals, and redeems. God is the constant presence, the constant other that you're encountering or interacting with throughout life. If you do it when you're like, you can do that through prayer, through speaking out into a void. Like again, what God is, like we talked about last time, that's not something we're going to come anywhere close to even trying to answer. And it's going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, that word. But for Rosenzweig, it's this other that you confront throughout life. It's the force behind creation, right? It's the force, it's the underlying power behind everything existing. It's the thing that challenges you, but it's not an object of knowledge. It's not something like Maimonides said, we have to understand God. He says it's not. Just like another human being you encounter. When you encounter a human being, your modus operandi isn't to encounter another human being and figure out, maybe for some people it is. They're saying it's not to like figure out and come down with like some sort of psychoanalysis, scientific analysis, biological analysis. You don't look at someone and then sort of abstract and come out with a summary of like who they are. You're existing, if you're really interacting with a person in this kind of approach, you're being challenged by and interacting with a human. You're not coming out with objective data. You're coming into it with some sort of encounter. Same thing with God. It's not an object of knowledge like from Maimonides that you're trying to like understand, but it's encountered in the in-between of human existence and the relationships between humanity, the world, and God's self.
And that leads to a more dynamic interaction.
Yeah, it's the constant challenging. It's whatever you experience, that constant challenging of yourself, pushing of yourself, encountering and forcing you to ask questions. That's the encounter with God, I think, in Rosenzweig's language, right? This encounter calls humanity to respond with their whole being, right? It's the thing that calls you and pushes you to respond. There's an other there. Again, many people might say, I don't experience that as an other. Rosenzweig saying that's fundamental. We can disagree with him. You don't have to buy into what he's saying, but this is his understanding of just what it means to walk around in the world. You are being challenged by, it's just there.
You're there.
Yeah.
How were these thoughts perceived by his peers or mainstream Jewish thinkers at the time?
Rosenzweig becomes a very influential thinker in the conservative movement. When did
the conservative movement begin? Was he a founder of it?
I don't think he's the founder of a movement. He's a major intellectual influence in it. I don't know when you'd say the conservative movement started. I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know the history of that well enough.
But they latched on to him.
He becomes influential because, as we'll see, he takes Jewish law seriously. So in the origins of the Reform movement, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but it's good framing, right? If these movements sort of Orthodox conservative reform largely emerge in Germany in like the 19th century, the origins of reform basically say, with Abraham Geiger, all the ritual law, all the ritual of Judaism is sort of a vestige. It's antiquated. It's not really relevant anymore. The core of what Judaism has to say is ethical monotheism. It's the ethics that emerge from the Bible and largely from the prophets. They put aside the ritual as sort of an ancient relic, and it's focused on the ethics of the prophets. That's why, there's famously in its origins, the Reform movement actively got rid of all ritual. They actively, they had there's a famous conference in Pittsburgh, and they intentionally serve non-kosher food. And I don't know if it was shellfish or pig. I don't remember. It's done intentionally to make a statement. The ritual has served its function. It's gone. We're focused on the ethics. Orthodoxy saw itself really as reaction to these other movements of saying no, the law is eternal. The Jewish law, all of halakha of Jewish law remains permanent exactly how it is. Rosenzweig took ritual and law and commandments seriously, and so that very much distinguished him from Reform. But he didn't see every word of ancient law as binding, and that sort of separated him from the Orthodox. And that's where very much he fits in the conservative movement that has a real tradition. The conservative movement has a real halachic tradition and halachic system, but it's much more liberal than the Orthodox one. Sorry?
It is conservative.
It is conservative, and it actually has a formal halachic process. The Reform movement doesn't have a halachic process in the same way. That's not a criticism. That's just the reality. Yeah. It doesn't have a Jewish legal process. The conservative movement still, its governing bodies in America put out Jewish legal positions. The Reform movement doesn't do that. So he becomes important in that movement. It's sort of in between the Orthodox and the further liberal movements. Okay, so now we talked about these sort of three entities that exist in the world for Rosenzweig, and he talks about them relating to each other in three basic ways, in concepts of, and these are important religious concepts, definitely in the Jewish tradition, but in general, of creation self-explanatory, the things coming into being created by God, revelation, which is God revealing himself to humans, and redemption, some sort of future messianic, perfection.
So creation is always by God?
In religious language, when you talk about the creation in a religious context, humans are also seen as creators or partners of God in creation, often in the Jewish tradition. But here we're talking about sort of the relationship between God and the world, of God as the creator, in this context, yeah.
So is it noted before humans?
Is what? Is
Judaism before humans? Is there a context for that?
I mean, as an active tradition, it doesn't exist before humans because it sees itself. I mean, whether you're taking from an Orthodox perspective, it's revealed to humans. From a more liberal perspective, even if you don't believe in a revelation, it is a tradition of humans.
I meant Homo sapiens as opposed to Neanderthals.
It doesn't really speak to pre-Homo sapiens, sort of the whatever species evolutionarily would have existed before that. It doesn't speak to that. The Bible definitely doesn't actively acknowledge those types of species or predecessors. If you're in the Orthodox, if you want to take the Bible seriously as revelation and also accept those types of scientific discoveries, you're going to work on some sort of model either of the biblical story of creation as being metaphorical or an allegory, or if it's sort of not being meant to describe what happened, but meant to sort of teach a lesson or sort of position what man's role is in the world, you're going to have to reread it as not literal. But he's not reading it as literal, so for him that wouldn't be an issue. Okay, so now I want to move to section 3, where we'll talk about the relationship between man, the world, and God for Rosenzweig. So we'll start again with trying to read a quote from the actual Star of Redemption. Again, he's very hard to read, so then we'll look at some secondary sources. So let us formulate it briefly and safely leave the more detailed explanation for the later course of things. God was since always. So God always there. Man became, man came into existence. The world is becoming. The world is still in process because the world is moving towards redemption. That's the goal of man, is to respond to revelation in order to bring about redemption. As regard any distinctions we could still make between the... Okay, I just want to skip a bit.
I imagine this is in German and translated?
Yes, this is translated from German. Okay, so for what we recognize till now of the all by recognizing the everlasting elements was only the mystery of their everlasting birth. So the birth of things is creation. It's a mystery. It's not yet manifest to us. Cannot be You know what? I'm going to skip this source because it's a little too dense to read. So let's go to source B, and then we'd be able to come back to that if we want. B will describe creation. In Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption, creation isn't a singular past event. Responding a bit to your question, it's not. For Rosenzweig, creation isn't like the biblical, in 7 days God created the world. The first day he made this, the second day he made that. It's not like a sort of thing that happened at a point in the past, but an ongoing act of God's love. It's the establishment of the relationship between God and the world, bringing the world into being and imbuing it with meaning. Creation isn't merely the physical act of making something, but the establishment of a relationship, a facing between God and the world. It's the foundation upon which revelation and redemption occur, providing the stage for the unfolding God's plan. So basically, creation for him is the relationship. We have these 3 important beings that exist. There's God, man, world. Creation is the God-world relationship. It's the source, God as a source of the world, as imbuing it with meaning, as sort of enabling it to exist. Whatever that means, if you take that as a metaphor, if you take God as a sort of battery for the world, if you take it as a literal, God created the world in 7 days at a certain point in time, but it's the creation is this enabling of the continued existence of the world on a stage that will hopefully allow it to eventually be redeemed or reach some sort of more perfect state. Revelation, if you look at the next source, revelation for Rosenzweig is not simply the imparting of information or doctrines. So typical Orthodox tradition would see revelation is what happens at Sinai. At Sinai, God reveals himself to the Jewish people and recites the 10 Commandments, the entire 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the Chumash. Those are dictated by God to Moses. That is revelation. It's God revealing himself to the people of Israel and to Moses, word for word, giving laws and doctrines. Right? So for Rosenzweig, it's not just that, but a transformative encounter between God and humanity. It's a face-to-face experience where God speaks to the individual, calling them out of their isolation and into a relationship. Relationship happens to every individual, or is possible to happen to every individual. It's the fundamental relationship for him between God and humans, and every human has that ability to experience that being called, being challenged, being both loved and challenged. That's revelation. This encounter is not just intellectual, it engages the whole person, heart, mind, and will. Revelation is the moment of being addressed by God, being recognized, called into a relationship. It's a personal and historical event shaping the individual's understanding of themselves and their place in the world. It's the encounter between the human and God. It can happen on a grand level, it can happen on an individual level, quietly at night in your bedroom or out in nature. It's being faced by God in some way and being called. That's revelation. Redemption, the third, right? So we have the 3 entities, right? God to world is the relationship's creation. God to man is revelation. Redemption is the relationship man's supposed to play in relationship to the world. Redemption, the Star of Redemption, is not simply a future event, right? It's not some like messianic era where like a Messiah rides in on a donkey and redeems the world, but a present possibility. It's the healing of the brokenness in the relationship between God, humanity, and the world. Redemption is an ongoing process striving towards wholeness and reconciliation. It's realized in the between of human existence and the encounters with God and others, not just about individual salvation, but restoration of creation. Basically, the idea is that in that there's this revelation where man is challenged by faces God. And the idea is out of that encounter, man is supposed to be inspired to try to achieve redemption. Right? Redemption in traditional religious dogma is like the Messiah coming at the end of the day. Rosenzweig, again, that sees that as a bit more metaphorical and saying redemption is something, man is challenged to create redemption in every interaction he has, in every step that he walks through the world or she walks through the world. It's Kabbalistic in that it's metaphorical, but
parallel to a Kabbalistic approach of the broken vessel.
There's a fixing. There's that element of like the world. There's a need for man to fix the world. God gives man this task of fixing the world. I think Kabbalah has a much more. It's got a rich metaphysics. There's a lot more going on in the heavens. And so you'll do a mitzvah, or you'll put on tefillin, or you'll do a certain ritual, perform a certain ritual act, and that actually makes things better. I don't think it's as direct for Rosenzweig, because I don't think he has that metaphysics, right? But that whole lived religious life, hopefully, and that life in the encounter with God enables you to bring the world to a better place. This is a lot of and again, we started by saying he wanted to be more in lived life and not in philosophy. This is still very abstract, but this is him trying to put together a system of what it means to live a religious life, right? And the idea of him is the idea he's saying is to live religious life means you face the world as a broken thing that's out there that we interact with all the time. And we're challenged by God, we interact with God, whatever that means, we're challenged to actually go about and fix it. There's, from the philosophical perspective, that actually can bring it down to a much more mundane lived life, if that's how we're meant to interact with the world for him. And that's what it means to live a religious life. I want to now we'll skip source E, and I want to talk a little bit about how he relates these to, because this is all very vague, and this doesn't necessarily, this can work with any religious tradition, right? There's nothing yet that's sort of inherently Jewish about this, to be honest. So in source 4, I want to talk a little bit about, and to my knowledge, he doesn't write too much about religions other than Judaism and Christianity, so I'm not sure what he'd say about Islam or Eastern religions. I'm not sure what he would say. But he talks very clearly about what he sees the roles of Judaism versus Christianity are in this respect. And remember, he almost converted to Christianity, right? He thought Christianity was like the end game, and then he kind of stepped back and said, whoa, these both have roles. So if you look at source 4, this is from an essay by Will Herberg. Will Herberg was early to mid 20th century Jewish thinker, also a more liberal Jewish thinker, started off in the Communist parties, or very anti-religious in America, and then he was in America the whole time. And then sort of became a little more religiously conservative, but not still very much in the liberal lowercase Jewish world, more in the reform or conservative Jewish world, but sort of came back to a more to value religion and ritual much more than he did as sort of early on. Anyways, this is an essay of his on Franz Rosenzweig. He says Judaism and Christianity are to Rosenzweig, essentially one piece. They're one religious reality. Judaism facing inward to the Jews, Christianity outward to the Gentiles. The two faiths are organically linked as complementary aspects of God's revealed truth. Right. So first of all, atypical for a Jewish religious thinker, Judaism and Christianity are both true. Right? They serve different roles. They're two sides of a coin, of a divine coin of what God's asking the world. Again, what he'd say about the other religions, I don't know. Yet they are not the same. They're distinct and different in their being and in their function. Judaism. Okay, we'll skip his metaphors. While Israel stays with God, Christianity goes out to conquer the unredeemed world for him. Christianity would not endure as a force for redemption, did not Israel remain in its midst, and it's serving as a witness to the eternal. Borrowing the imagery of Yehuda Halevi, so Yehuda Halevi is a medieval Jewish thinker who Rosenzweig had a deep sort of appreciation for. He was also sort of a mystical poet, and Rosenzweig translated his poems to German and commented on them. So borrowing his imagery, Rosenzweig speaks of the historical revelation of Israel as a seed, which falling on the ground of paganism produces a tree. So Judaism sort of falls into the pagan world. It plants a seed. The tree that comes out is Christianity, and the fruit of which it reappears in another form. Christianity is in fact Judaism for the Gentiles, through which the people of the world are brought to the God of Israel. Yet as close as are the two, so are they different, and the difference is not to be overcome by goodwill. Right? It's not like Hegel thought, the world's culminating, everything's moving towards sort of one universal Protestantism. He's saying that's not going to be the case. They always stay separate. Only when the goal is reached and the world is redeemed at the end will the final reconciliation take place, and everyone will recognize God. Anyways, he has this vision of these sort of two traditions existing alongside each other. And what they do, he says, Judaism remains, as the way he phrased it, is a sort of, it lives outside of time. It's like this relationship, it's not involved in the world, they don't assimilate in the world, we sort of stay in this sort of separate, like, romantic bubble between the Jewish people and God, as sort of like a reminder, like a symbol or a signpost to the world. And Christianity goes out there, and again, the other religions I don't know, but Christianity goes out there and does the work of actually bringing the world into this relationship to God. They're serving sort of two different but like parallel functions. The reason I'm bringing this up is just one, important if we're trying to understand his thinking. How he sees this in reality, I think this is why for him the ritual and a lot of those parts of Jewish law that for the Reform movement sort of became irrelevant. For him, it's part of living in this sort of bubble with God. Like the Jewish people live in this sort of unique space outside of time. They're persecuted. They don't really participate in history. For him, they don't have a state. Again, he's pre-Holocaust. He doesn't really believe, he's anti-Zionist. Everyone's relationship to Zionism and Jews having a state changed drastically post-Holocaust because all of a sudden Jews not having a state became extremely dangerous, right? So before that, when especially in Germany, there was a sense among a lot of the Jews in Germany that they'd sort of reached this sort of perfect, like American Jews now, or at least maybe until recently, I don't know, but you know, people thinking there was this golden age where they thought like this was it. We don't need, like, we're home. We're just Jews in Germany and we're Germans. And German Jews were extremely proud Germans, like American Jews are as proud Americans. And so he thought, you know, Jews are now transplanted as seeds among the world as these little signposts and reminders, like, you know, sprinkled all over the globe as Christians sort of go out. And I don't think he was necessarily supporting like Christian missionizing and like going out and converting the world, but like Jews were I'm not sure, but Jews were kind of like the sign there reminding people about this relationship with God and the goal of achieving redemption. That's his vision.
I think that was complementary.
Absolutely. And Judaism and Christianity, 100% complementary. Other traditions, and if there's multiple ways to God, it can work with his thought to say there's all sorts of multiple ways to God. There's nothing inherent here that says it has to be Jewish or has to be Christian. He was living in a world where all there really was around him was Judaism and Christianity. So that's all he really had to deal with directly. But there's nothing inherently here there's nothing inherently anti-pluralistic here, right? You can have, especially because it's the revelation that happens between man and God is on an individual, often on an individual level, it might be able to happen in all sorts of different traditions. There's a space here, like the structure allows for religious pluralism, whether he'd endorse it or not, I'm not sure. Anyways, I want to now talk, if we go to source 5, a little bit about how he actually relates to some particular Jewish concepts. Because everything we've talked about, I think much more than the other thinkers we've covered because of the world that Rosenzweig comes from, of this sort of German academic philosophical world. The other thinkers we've talked about are much more grounded in, we talked about, so going back to Berkovits is like a great example. Eliezer Berkovits talked about the function of Jewish law as trying to create a society. The goal of the society was trying to model what a great society can be. And so the reason Jews need autonomy is not just to save them from being killed. That's sort of like the negative reason. But it's really to try to embody, if the goal of the tradition is to say, what can we build as a model of how to conduct war, how to have a judiciary, how to deal with economics? If we want to conduct this grand experiment of trying to create a model society, we need to have a society. We need to have a state, and we need to deal with all sorts of issues. And the reason the Jewish law deals with all sorts of nitty-gritty details, because if you want to build a society, your laws have to have details, right? You can't have traffic law that says, like, drive safely, period, right? So people want religious law that says, like, be good, be nice to God. It's like that. If you're trying to build a society, that doesn't work, right? Berkovits has very concrete relationship to, his philosophy is very concrete answers to some particular questions about what it means to be Jewish or why our tradition functions how it does, right? Needs a state because that's what you need to build a society. You can't build a society without some sort of political autonomy. You can't figure out what a good economics is unless you have a political body governing economics and a legislature. You can't, right? So we need law and we need a lot of detail and we need like a lot of structures to do that. This is very, very vague, and how this relates to why we need the particular systems we do, like, it's very vague, and that's, I think, a weakness. Maybe it's a weakness in his thought, and maybe it's just part of the reality of, again, he came from this philosophical tradition, and he wasn't as Jewishly learned. He became more Jewishly learned over time, but that was a project for him, right? Like, he came with a different set of tools, and he offered a bit of a construct, and then said, got involved in adult Jewish education, so let's figure out how to work in this construct and learn about actual details of Jewish life and apply it, but that wasn't what he wrote about, because it wasn't his strength. So I recognize this is a lot more up in the air, sort of conceptual or abstract than we typically are, but that's what we're dealing with in terms of reading his thought. So I want to spend the last sort of 10 minutes on source 5 on how he talks about some specific Jewish concepts. So one, biblical revelation. This is again from the article by Will Herbert, right? So in Orthodox Jewish tradition, God reveals himself on Sinai, speaks to the whole people, gives the 10 commandments, speaks to Moses and dictates the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, the Torah. So what does Rosenzweig say about that? Rosenzweig agrees that Scripture is a compilation made by men, agrees now with the more liberal side, not with the Orthodox tradition, right? Scripture is compiled by men. But he nevertheless insists that it contains the revelation of God, right? It's a compilation by men who wrote it, but contains the revelation of God. God reveals himself through his encounter with man, and the Bible is preeminently the record of the divine encounter with Israel, in which God makes known his will and displays his judgments and mercies. So we talked about revelation for him, right? Revelation is man being confronted by God. It's not necessarily man being confronted by God saying, like, a long transcription of a long speech that man then wrote down. It can be more abstract. But when man then articulates what came out of that, so again, like a simple example, like you have an experience on a mountaintop or on wherever you find your spiritual experiences. And then you try to write down, and you're a brilliant writer, right? You try to articulate what that was. There's a revelation in that, if that really was an encounter between man and God. For him, again, it's not that like every single person who tries to do that would make it into the Bible, right? There's a degree of this is sort of our greatest recording of that encounter, but it's still recorded in man's words for him. Of course, the books of the Bible were put together and edited by men in the course of centuries, and therefore contain God's word only as it's passed through the medium of the human heart and mind. Does not the Talmud itself say Torah speaks in the language of men? But it contains God's words nevertheless. By the way, if you said this in a standard sort of Jewish Orthodox context, this would say this is heresy. It's not so foreign, though, to the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition, even in the Orthodox world, differentiates between the prophecy or the revelation of the 5 books of Moses and the remainder of the prophets. The 5 books of Moses are seen as the word of God, literally, right? And Maimonides has in his Principles of Faith that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are transcribed word for word from God. But all the other prophets, so we have, right, if the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, is composed of the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and then the writings are sort of the 3 sections. The prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, etc., even within the Orthodox tradition, these prophets are understood as having had some form of experience of revelation of God and transcribing it in their own words. So the idea that we can have human composed documents that contain a message from the divine is not foreign to sort of Orthodox Judaism. What's foreign to Orthodox Judaism is the 5 books of Moses live on a unique plane. And this is where conservative and Orthodox, one of the key places where they might differ is in the conservative movement and for Rosenzweig as well. The 5 books of Moses too, but they contain a divine message. They contain a message from God. It just might not be a literal word for word. So it's still to be taken incredibly seriously, but the fact that there's like an added letter in this particular spot might not be as important. That's also a key way, Jeff, in terms of you asked, where he fits. That's very much within the conservative movement.
Don't they say divinely inspired?
That's the idea. I think that's how you would describe. I think even an Orthodox way you describe like Jeremiah, the prophet, right? It's not the divine word. It's
but not the 5 books.
No, the 5 books. Yeah, and that's a key difference in sort of orthodoxy versus a more conservative approach. So oral law and halakha. Okay, so right, the oral law. Again, in the Orthodox tradition, there's the 5 books of Moses sort of given on Sinai, so to speak, and then there's a whole oral tradition, right? So like one of the classic examples given is like, okay, so the Torah says, put a sign on your arm and your head, right? And there's almost unanimous consent among the rabbis. There's debate on the details, but what these are phylacteries or tefillin, which are specific boxes made a specific way with specific ropes, inside of which contain parchment that has specific text. Like the Bible is very terse. From it, you might think you have to have a tattoo or just like go like this. Like there's lots of things you could think that sentence means. Yet there's a shared conception among the rabbis. There's a lot of agreement on what this looks like, and they'll debate on the details. This is seen in the Orthodox world as evidence that there's accompanying the 5 books of Moses is a sort of oral tradition that comes down from Sinai of a lot of the details, like the sort of explanation of what the Torah intends to say. And halakha is just Jewish law, and the broad corpus of Jewish law, both divine and human-made. So Rosenzweig writes, the oral Torah is a stream parallel to the written Torah, sprung from the same source. For us, it's the completion of the unity of the book written through the unity of the book is read, right? It's the unity of the book that we have and the tradition of interpretation and understanding it. Multiplicity of centuries, writers, and readers, the eye that sees the book not from the outside but its inner coherence, sees it not merely as written but read, right? When you're learning the Torah, you're learning the tradition from within the tradition. You don't just read it as a text. You read it in light of the centuries or millennia of our tradition of reading that text. That's the oral tradition. That's the sort of tradition of Jewish law and of rabbinic tradition of how we understand our own revelations. And halachic observance, right, acting out Jewish law, is acting out of the Jews' affirmation of the chosenness of Israel, its separation as a priest people, of being holy to God. This is the meaning of Israel's existence, right, as sort of this separate people who is holy to God and sort of lives in this unique space with God. And the grounding of this life is in the sort of tradition of traditional ritual observance, of the way the Jews have always done it. And again, here's how we see Rosenzweig fitting in between the conservative and Orthodox world. It's no longer every detail has to be done the way it is because God said so, and that's sort of the only way to achieve religious perfection. But it's also very much pushing against the sort of reform, like rituals old and antiquated. We just have to be good people and feel spiritual. And no, we have a millennia-old sort of transcription of our revelation of the interaction between man and God through our people's history, and our way of living through all of this is an expression of that sort of unique Jewish life between man and God. And he takes that to an extreme where he says even customs, and not only like legalistic customs, even customs of Jewish food, like it's an entire way of living that is part of this encounter, and we can't throw away any of it. So unlike the Reformed tradition, says everything's important, but it's not that it's all divine and you can sort of figure it out, but we have to live within this whole structure of Jewish life and everything it has to offer. We'll read about two more concepts and we'll wrap up. So C, when he talks about personal halachic obligation, and this is a key part where, again, he'll separate from the Orthodox. What is your obligation as a Jew? Right? So the Orthodox answer is your obligation as a Jew is to observe Jewish law. Right? There might be more ethical and all sorts of things, all sorts of goals and purposes on top of that, but there's a fundamental obligation to abide by religious law, which means you say certain prayers by a certain time of day, you do certain acts, you eat certain foods, you say blessings before and after eating foods. Like there's a whole way of life. For Rosenzweig, all that way of life is beautiful and to be embraced, but it's not a legal obligation of every detail. So how does he see what is your obligation? Jewish observance is halakha, right? Living a Jewish life, observing a Jewish life is the Jewish law. The Jew lives under the law, and the special discipline to which halakha subjects him is the commandment of God involved in the election of Israel. But to say that is a far cry from asserting, as the fundamentalists do, this is Will Herberg again, he's criticizing the Orthodox, that's who he's calling fundamentalists, right? That the particular detailed observances that confront the Jew at any time are their eternal prescription from God who communicated to Moses on Sinai. It's not that every detail comes from Moses on Sinai. The commandments are not fixed and eternal. They have arisen, have changed. Many of them have lost their effectiveness with passage of time. As with Scripture, so with halakha. It's fruitless, even meaningless, to attempt a single and definitive differentiation between human and divine. Okay, the best example that I think I can give of this is think about like a biological organism, right? So there's like I think that, again, I'm not a scientist, but I think that they say like every cell in your body or all the matter in your body over the course of 7 years is replaced. I think it's something like that, right? So like in 7 years from now, nothing physically that's a part of me is still there, right? So put aside questions of soul or whatever. So there's a philosophical question of like, okay, so what makes me, right? Literally every cell, every neuron in my brain is going to be replaced. In 7 years, there's nothing left of what was me. Rosenzweig, I think, is saying that, but there's a continuity, right? There's a continuous evolution, or you can think about an evolution of a species, like a species that started here and ended there over millennia might look nothing like what it originally looked like, but there's a natural evolution. It wasn't just like a giraffe, and then like one day it said, you know what, like I'm a rat. Like there's a process involved. He's describing the lived life of the Jewish people as that. So it's not that for him every law is eternal and stays as it is, but we have to live within this sort of, there's this organic ongoing life of the Jewish people before God that continues to evolve. So that's sort of on the broader people level. And so on the one hand, it's not this orthodox approach of everything is eternal, and yet it's not that we can't throw anything out at the same time. We have to sort of embrace and interact with everything. On the personal level, if we skip to the second paragraph, religious observance must be personally appropriated. It must be not just halakha, but halakha for me. The entire body of halachic tradition, ever changing yet ever the same, confronts the individual Jew as gazettes, as law in the external sense. So the initial encounter with the Jewish tradition, we talked about this in a different context last week with Rabbi Soloveitchik, but you encounter it originally as law. It's just like, this is what Jews do. It's all these rules and details. To be operative, to be functional, it must be turned into gebot, into the word or commandment. So we talk about revelation as that sort of man encountering God. The idea is for it to really count as halakha for him, to count as Jewish binding law, it has to be converted. It has to actually be personalized or converted into something that you experience God is commanding to you. Right, and so he goes on saying, in the end, it's not decisive. Sorry, let me find the right spot. Right, he says only selecting like sort of what you do and don't do, how you live, so you encounter everything and certain things become internalized. This selection, because it's not dependent upon the will, but the ability to do, right? It's up to your ability to convert that law into something spoken to you, necessarily remains an individual matter. So we live as a people in this sort of organism of the Jewish tradition, the way of life, but there's still this sort of this like selection of what you do, which again makes him very much not in the Orthodox world, where there's a degree of personal selection. Only personal ability to fulfill the precept can decide. You can read more of that again on your own, but the idea here being, again, he walks this line of, on the one hand, denying the bindingness of every single thing comes from God and is imperative on you, but also denying that you have almost a right to be dismissive of any part of it, right? And he has, in one of his essays, I don't remember, I read this a long time ago, but he talks about, he goes to the degree of, he mentions, I don't remember if it's like kugel or chillins or what, he mentions like specific Jewish foods. He's like, you cannot go without this. Like living as a Jew requires experiencing every part of what it means to be a Jew before you can sort of figure out what it means for you. Yeah.
Is he saying that you're not obligated to keep all of it, but you still have to? Does he say you have to strive to keep more, or?
So I think that's where he differentiates from an Orthodox thinker. It's not that he sees, the ideal isn't, it's not that there's a code of law or a mode of practice that is the ideal, but everyone is sort of on their way and it's okay to be in different places in relation to that. He actually says it's like it's your obligation to engage with, to study, to try, to experiment, to engage with all of it, but it actually literally isn't all binding on you. And that's very much not the Orthodox world. But unlike the Reform world, the entire corpus is still tremendously important, and you can't be dismissive of any of it. And so that's where he sort of walks this line in the middle, and that's why he becomes so influential in the conservative movement. Because he believes in revelation, he believes this is God interacting with and speaking, but it's not as literal and it's not as imperative in the details. The last source I want to talk about is his relation to Jewish political autonomy, to Zion and Zionism. And again, like we said, he died in 1929, and what he would have, and he died young of ALS. If he had lived another 20 years, this thought might have looked very, very different. But he says, the saga of the internal people, different from those of the other people of the world, does not begin with autochtony. I looked up this word. It means like a inherent relationship with the land, right? So a lot of like mythical origin stories of peoples, right? They see themselves as born out of the land in which they live, right? There's literally, they're formed from the dust of the earth in which they live. What's ironic or really interesting about, if you think about the Jewish story in the Torah and the Bible, is we fundamentally see ourselves as foreigners, right? Where man is created out of the earth of the world, but the earth of Eden, which is a place that is not really a place, right? It's not a place we know where it is or exists. So the place where we come from is not a place we can find. There is no place that we're fundamentally from. And the forefather of the Jewish people, Abraham, right, is born in Mesopotamia. His father is commanded by God to start a journey towards Canaan, towards the promised land that Avram eventually finishes. But fundamentally sees himself as a foreigner. Not sure I think there's a lot to talk about if you want to do a class on like biblical interpretation of what that means and why, on the one hand, the entire 5 books of Moses are a story of a journey to a land. If you think about it, they start basically, other than the first 10, 11 chapters, they start with Abraham, pulling Abraham out and saying, go to this land, I'll show you. And the whole rest of it is basically the story of the Jewish people trying to get there, and it ends on the precipice with Moses looking over the land, giving a people his last will and testament, so to speak, like the whole book of Devarim, the whole last book of the 5 books. There's Moses' grand speech to the Jewish people before they leave. And then the book ends on this cliffhanger of like, will the people succeed to build a great society there? And then sadly, it ends with a beautiful cliffhanger. You go to read the books of the prophets, and it's a mess. It's like up and down. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's great, but then it falls apart. Like it's very real in that sense. there's moments of beauty and a lot of disaster, and that's kind of like, it's very real. It's not utopian at all. But the whole 5 books are a book of a journey to a land, but we don't come from that land, which is interesting. Now, saying that politically nowadays is all sorts of complicated things. We've been there a long time. I'm not saying we're foreigners to the land. I'm not getting involved in politics here, right? But our story, our origin story, is saying is a story of being a foreigner, and that's important, right? So Rosenzweig saying, right, unlike other peoples of the world, our story doesn't begin with emerging from our land. Israel's ancestor is a wanderer with the divine command to leave his native land and go to a country God will show him. Thus begins the story as told in the sacred books, right? That's the story of God meeting Abraham and say, go, right? Only by exile does this people become a people, right? We're forged in Egypt is the story of our people. We're forged as a people outside of our land. Nor does it possess a fatherland in the usual sense. Rosenzweig was no Zionist, at least not in the familiar nationalistic acceptance of the term, though he had a strong love for Zion, a fatherland of which a people becomes party by plowing itself, as it were, into it. Such a fatherland the eternal people does not possess. The land Zion belongs to it only as the land of its yearning is the Holy Land. This again echoes Rosenzweig's understanding of the Jewish people is meant to be the signpost for the world of like the eternal people outside of history living this relationship of God. It doesn't make sense for them to have a political state. It makes sense for them to live outside of time, eternally yearning for a state. For Berkovitz, like Jews are trying to build a society. Of course you need a state. Like, this is all putting aside like do you need a state for safety, but talking about like religious goals. Right? So for him, like we're this eternal people sprinkled among the nations as this reminder of the path to redemption. Right? So until the end, when the yearning and promise be fulfilled, our destiny remains, right, to be both centered upon Zion, but living in the exile. If we skip down to this last source and then we'll finish, the peoples of the world are always straining through their historical enterprise and institutions to bring time to a stop and secure for themselves a measure of eternity, right? The goal of most people, not individuals, like peoples, nations, is to build like something perfect in the world, right? Think about the founding story of America, right? To build a new Jerusalem, to build a land on the hill and build something great in this world. But for God's people, eternity is ever present. Israel lives in eternity because it represents in time the eternal kingdom of God. It's sort of a sign of of a redemption sprinkled throughout the world. And we're not the ones, this is where he said it was Christianity's role almost to actually go about and do the work on the world. We live as that signpost. It lives and waits for the great day of the Lord when redemption will come, for Israel, for mankind, and for all being. Israel, the elect people, right? So this concept of chosenness is very important to him because we serve this special purpose. Israel finds its vocation as the suffering servant of the Lord. Again, ironic that he writes this just a little bit before the Holocaust. Rosenzweig's vision is essentially the prophetic conception as the idea of a Jewish people beyond state and territory, a divine instrument in man's overcoming nature through a supernatural process in history. I don't know if there's a way to sum up because we talked about a lot of different pieces here, but if we were to sum up, again, I am sad that there's a bunch of people who sort of last week, were a bit frustrated by we're covering a very, very much a sort of orthodox perspective on what it means, on what our tradition means, and how it's the living the life of halakha, of Jewish law, that enables the achievement of religious perfection. So we tried to bring a bit of a different perspective here. And Rosenzweig comes from this philosophical world, rejects it to a degree, and basically says we live like nature, how we live. We live in this relationship where there's God, humans, and the world as 3 fundamentally separate things. We interact as God is the source of being for the world. He confronts man through revelation, which is both perhaps in history and also in an immediate way to people throughout history, and challenges man to bring that world to redemption. The goal of the Jewish people in all of that is living as a signpost of that goal. All of our tradition is a record of that and of that encounter between man and God, and all of it is taken deeply seriously in that way. But there's an individualistic component of what revelation means, and so it's not as formal and objective as it is in sort of the Orthodox world. But there's still a deep goal of the Jewish people in the world. Again, I think the fact that he died in 1929 is very, to me, it leaves a bit of a cliffhanger because I would love to know how someone like this would have responded to Jews can't escape history, right? I mean, you look at the Holocaust, you look at not to compare or to compare October 7th, like we can pretend to live in this eternal bubble and maybe there was a bit of, golden ages, like there was a golden age in Germany, but we can't escape history. So how you live as this eternal people when you really have to deal with history and what that means, I would have loved to see how he responded to it. But
I'd love
yeah.
to see your essay on his view today.
I have to read a lot more of his stuff. There's a lot more people who are better versed than I am on that. But I wish we could have seen him respond to it. Sadly, it's not going to happen.